All right. So we are going to look at a short passage this morning from Matthew, looking at the story of the wise men. And it's going to come up on the screen. Matthew 2 tells the account of the Magi. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they'd heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they'd seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. We are in nativity season, not just in church, but in primary schools as well. And on Friday, I was one of many parents in the school hall at Greystones, watching Emily and her 5-year-old companions doing the nativity play. So you can picture the scene: a low stage with a bunch of 5-year-olds on. Emily was a sheep. There were cows. There were chickens. There were a couple of donkeys, shepherds, Mary and Joseph, of course, and the wise men, these three kings. But the wise men that we find at the nativity play, and that you might find on Christmas cards, where they're on their camels with their kingly, what's that called? Crown, thank you. Yeah, with a crown. That's not actually how the story is described here, is it? So before we look at these men, we're just going to unpack a few myths. So firstly, they weren't kings. The idea of them being kings actually comes in much more recent tradition. They were wise men, or magi. And magi was a term used to describe priests from Persia, so modern day Iran. And the name had also come to use for astrologers or magicians. And we know that at least some of these men were astrologers because they followed this star. So the star had spoken to them. Today I'm going to be referring to them as wise men because that's perhaps the easiest translation for us. Where they came from, we can't be sure. This passage tells us they came from the east, though. And another thing that we might be getting wrong is the number of them. Because on the Christmas cards you see the 3 on their camels. We don't know if there were actually 3, it doesn't say. That might be because there were 3 gifts. So that might be the reason. I'm certainly drawn to the idea that there's 3 of them. And finally, this might spoil some nativity scenes that you've got at home. So if like us, you've got something on your fireplace in the lounge with these wise men peering over the baby in a manger, you have to take them away because they weren't actually there. So from the account, we see they actually arrived quite a bit later, possibly 2 years later. So, myths busted. What we're going to do today is look at their response to Jesus, and as we do that, we're not just going into a Christmas story of the nativity scene and all of the Christmas traditions that we might experience here in the UK with snowy scenes, and detaching from the time of worship that we just had. The two are so connected and linked. We're going to look at how the wise men respond to Jesus and what that might mean for us. Firstly, the wise men's response showed great faith. So they've done this journey. If you think about the worst journey that you have ever been on, any horrifying accounts come to mind. For me, I think back to when I was 13 and I went on a yacht with a school trip, so a 72-foot yacht, sailing out of Poole Harbour. Wonderful experience, and we sailed over to France. We did a night sail back though, from Cherbourg to the Isle of Wight one fateful evening, where the sea was choppy, the boat was pitched at about this angle all through the night. Everyone was vomiting, it was awful. However bad though our experiences, chances are that the journey these winesmen took would have been far harder. So they'd have probably been travelling for several months, difficult terrain, dangerous conditions. They've turned up with these wonderful gifts, haven't they, including gold. So they would have been at risk of bandits, having to travel with a whole collection of guards to protect them. So it's not hard to be impressed by the faith that these wise men showed. To think they travelled so far, dealing with all that hardship, off the back of finding a star, they felt, actually, we've got to pursue this, we've got to go for it. Radical response that showed great faith. And church leader and commentator Phil Moore puts it like this: their response was radical, but don't let that fool you that it wasn't reasonable. Their reaction to Jesus' birth was entirely proportionate to the momentous news that God had come to earth as a human being. Radical, but reasonable. And how about our response then to the news of Jesus? Could that be described as radical, but reasonable? There's a challenge here in that. Maybe if you don't consider yourself to be a Christian, there's a challenge in here. If God has actually come to earth as a human being, that's something worth investigating. A journey to take, like these wise men. And for those of us who say, yeah, we know Jesus, that's a challenge to us as well. How would our faith be described? Could it be described as radical? So faith is fundamental to following Jesus. We have saving faith when we first follow Jesus, choose to put our trust in him. But then beyond that initial decision, faith is the thing that propels us forward. It's meant to grow and deepen and mature as we disciple with Jesus. And God sometimes calls us to do things which aren't clear or aren't immediately obvious. Knowing many of the stories of those of you in the room, that's true for many experiences. I'm not one for New Year's resolutions, but this year, going into 2023, I felt challenged to focus on 4 things. And one of those things was to do what I felt God was asking without hesitation. Because so much of my life, I've had I think God might be saying this. But then I start to analyse it, and I start to kind of critique it, and I start to ponder it and sit with it, and all of a sudden I haven't actually acted on that thing. I don't know if you relate to that. And in the big things, and maybe even more so in the smaller things, it's like, I'm going to talk to that person. Well, should I talk to that person? Look at that. So this year I've been working on that, just doing what I feel God's challenging me to do. And this has led to some unusual and at times uncomfortable situations. So one scenario from a couple of weeks ago at work, I work in training and development, that's my bag, and a client had invited me to join a team meeting. So a team of internal trainers in a particular organisation, and they were having their end of year meeting, and then invited me to go along to share a few thoughts on a couple of topics. And in advance, they'd sent these topics, said, yeah, love to hear your thoughts on this and this and this. And Roger, bring a wild card topic. Okay, all right, great. So training and development in 2023, what might I have brought? Artificial intelligence, virtual reality, people are talking about that, coaching is always popular. So I'm praying through it, I was looking, love. Yeah, but what's my actual wild card? What should I actually go and talk to this team about? Love. Right. So I didn't have any more than that. I'd prepared a load of stuff for these other topics. Love, I just had that word. I feel God's telling me to talk about love. So at the end of the meeting, thanks for those ideas, Roger. Have you got a wild card topic? Yep. Yes. And I shared for a few moments on love. I can't remember what I said. It It's probably in the context of trading in the book. So it's hard though for faith to grow if we only play it safe. And we can't treat faith like petrol in a car. We can't go to the petrol station, fill up, and then start the journey. That is not how faith works. We see the star, alright, okay, I don't have enough in the tank as it stands, but I feel God's spoken, I'm going for it. So what's God asking you to do at the moment that doesn't have a guaranteed outcome, or is it clear why? Is God asking something of you? Has he brought something to mind, or like, I sense God's in this, before we unpack it with all sorts of analysis? What's he asking you to do? Also, as I was thinking through this, at the last minute, as you know, I sensed there was another question. What do you need to keep persevering with because God's spoken to you in the past? So if you're considering the wise men on their journey, and they've got halfway, and they're tired, no, but they chose to go on, didn't they? What's the equivalent for you that God's spoken to you about? You said, you've got to keep going. They didn't stop until they found Jesus. Secondly, the wise men's response showed radical, sacrificial, and adoring worship. So verse 7 says, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Remember now, this isn't the three wise men peering over the manger, kneeling on the hay in the stable. This is, they've gone to a home, and maybe Jesus is 2 years old. And I live with a 2-year-old. So I'm really having to rethink my nativity experience here. Because arriving at the home of a 2-year-old, what might those wise men have encountered? A bit of a mess, a lot of noise, some singing, tired parents perhaps, lots of love, I'm sure, lots of energy, raw emotions, restlessness. But the wise men seem to have grasped something that wasn't immediately obvious on a human level. Because they came and they bowed down. And they brought gifts that were valuable and pointed to the future role. So some commentators would say, right, gold. Gold is for a king. They see this 2-year-old, right, he's a king. Frankincense was burnt in the temple. So it's this worship to God. Right? This child is God. And myrrh used for embalming bodies after death. There's this recognition of Jesus' future, the sacrificial lamb. So we can't be sure if that's definitely what they meant by these gifts, but certainly for them to bow down to a 2-year-old and bring these gifts, they seem to grasp something of how God at his weakest was more powerful than any mere mortal. And they seem to get something of the power in weakness theme that Jesus later lived down and taught on. So Jesus comes not as one might expect a king to come. They went to Jerusalem, didn't they? They're like, oh, if we're looking for a king, we better go to the HQ. No, he's not there. He came in weakness. And the Bible teaches elsewhere that Jesus made himself nothing. And as an adult, he ultimately gave up everything at the cross. And because of that, God's exalted him to the highest place, above every other name. And when we sing, you're worthy of it all, come let us adore him. He's the one enthroned on high. He came with such a humble and meek and weak arrival. So the wise men worshipped. We all worship something or someone. Emmanuel, we're choosing as a community to worship Jesus, right? And we're an imperfect bunch, and it can be, messy at times. But that's what we're setting our sights on. Worship becomes a choice. There are times when Worship feels spontaneous, it springs up. I don't know if you get this, and sometimes music will do that for me, and I feel like worshipping, and yeah, great. Most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, it's a choice. So we choose, we're deliberate, we're intentional. The wise men's response showed radical, sacrificial, and adoring worship. Let's make that our goal for next year. That would be a community of people, not just in our singing. We're not just talking about singing. They came with gifts, didn't they? Worship for them is like what they brought, and the sacrifice they brought, and the journey they went on. May that be true of us next year. Thirdly, and finally, the wise men's response started a movement that has never stopped. Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? They asked in Jerusalem. And it's easy for us, easy for me at least, to forget that Jesus was born as a Jew. He came as the Jewish Messiah. He came to fulfill the Jewish prophecies. But the wise men weren't Jews. I love these notes. This was good. Right. So the wise men are the first Gentiles, the first non-Jews that came to Jesus, and they started a movement of people turning to Jesus that has carried on to this day. So over 2 billion people now, globally, chasing after Jesus. We get to play our part in the movement as well. So we're part of a family of churches called Catalyst, which is a church planting movement. Last month we did our financial gift day, didn't we? We've given money to churches getting started in Turkey. We've given money to churches getting started in Pakistan. It's not just about what we're giving. We've received this year. You think to when Dave was really unwell earlier in the year and off for that extended period of time. We had churches in our network sending people to come and teach, people praying for us. We were sent to plant originally with a financial gift, so we're part of that movement that the wise men started. And this movement grows, it's through conversations. Conversations about Jesus, people hearing about Jesus. So the worldwide family of believers, all which began with some wise men who had the faith to follow the star and worship the boy they found. We've seen their response showed great faith. Their response showed radical, sacrificial and adoring worship. And their response started a movement that has never stopped. So we too are called to show great faith. What's that thing that God says? Come on, this is what I'm calling you to. What do we need to keep saying yes to? What does it look like for us to respond with worship, which is radical, sacrificial and adoring? And how do we help grow the Jesus movement that started back then and continues to this day? So I'm going to hand back to Faith for another costume change.